Welcome back, guys. Welcome back to the start of lesson number 6. In the end of the last lesson, what we have now is we can actually drag the tasks, very good progress, and we can actually drop it. And when we drop those tasks, we are console logging the object, the type that we are sending with the task. What we want to do in this lesson is actually make sure that this function actually works, that when we drop it, we actually move the task from work in progress to done. And the way we're going to do that is, the first things first, I will actually duplicate this piece of code here, and I will pass that inside of the box target, so box target here. But the only change I will do here is I'm going to change this to done. So this piece of code is going to render any tasks that are in the task list, but that actually have the status of done. So what happens is these statuses are all here work in progress. They are all work in progress at the moment. So they are all work in progress at the moment, right? Now, what I want to do is change that to the actual task that will have done into them. I want to go back to box target as well and make sure that instead of drop here, what I will have here is actually going to be children. So children, which is coming from props. So let me change that to directly here. Const is going to be children equals props. So what I'm doing here is simply, what I'm doing here is simply saying, okay, props.children, oopsie, this is an N. This is an N there, and the props.children is going to be here. And this is going to render whatever we pass inside of it here. So now we need to specify what type is children, and in this case you can, I think you can just make it React node, I guess, React. Okay, so just simplify this, we can have this type as react.react node, and we are good to go. So what we are saying here is whatever children that you pass there, and the children are whatever the box target is actually encapsulating over here, whatever children that you pass here, just render it in between. And the idea is, right now, the children is actually an empty array simply because there is no tasks in the task list with status equal done. So this is the same code that we are using here to filter for only the task with the status equal work in progress. But because we are filtering for done and there are no done tasks, there will be nothing rendered there. I want to do a little bit of styling here as well. So I will simply just do rounded, oopsie, rounded equals medium. And let's give it, let's leave it like this for now. That's all right. So the idea here is that I need to write a function, and this function is going to change the task that we drag and we drop it over here is going to change the status of that task from work in progress to done. Once you do that, React is going to re-render everything, and once it re-renders everything, the done tasks are going to be shown up here and removed from there simply because you have switched their status from work in progress to done. So right now, my focus is writing a function that will take one of these tasks and change the status of them from work in progress to done. And the way we are going to do that is we are going to associate that task with the ID. So right now what I'm passing here is simply an item and some really weird stuff. So what I want to do here is actually pass an ID. So I'm going to pass the ID, and this ID is going to come from the props. So I'm going to add a new prop here called ID, and this prop is going to be a string as well. Okay, all good. Now there should be an error saying, okay, you said there is an ID here of string, but you're really not passing it on. And if you're not very familiar with TypeScript, if I put a question mark here, I'm saying to TypeScript that prop is optional. But because I don't have that question mark, the prop is not optional. It has to be there, and it's not actually rendering because it's telling you, hey, you said you have to pass a prop called ID, but you're not actually passing that prop. So if you recall, the way I'm actually rendering those tasks is by passing in the ID, is by passing in, the task that's coming from the task list. Let me just resize this a little bit. So we have a task list here with an ID, and each instant of these task cards have access to whatever is coming from that task. So I'm going to pass it here, task.id equal task.id. ID equals task.id, and I'm going to copy that one-liner also to here. Okay, this should make everything good. So right now what's happening is if I console log, if I go ahead and drop something on my drop target, what's going on is I'm actually getting access to that ID of that specific item that I am dropping. And this is exactly how we can target that specific item and change it into a done task. So we need to write a function that will take that ID and mutate or like change that piece of state, this array, to make that specific task done. Good. So now that we know what we're trying to achieve, so we can start by writing that function. But before we do that, there is something that we missed here that will actually cause an error in the future, and it's usually not a really good practice to miss it. And the reason that thing is simply that we don't have a type of all this stuff. And that's really not okay. So what I will do here is what I like to do, which is simply maybe in utils. You can put it in utils, you can put it, I think, in components, yeah. In components, what I will do is I'm gonna do something called interfaces.ts. This is going to be a file that will handle all my types and all my major interfaces that I'm going to use throughout the project. So what I will do here is I will do export interface, oopsie, give it a name, call it task in this case, export interface task. And we know that task has to have an ID of string. We also know that it has to have a status of string, and then we have a category. Category is also a string, and then we have details, that's an L, details of string as well, Okay, so did I cover everything? Let's go back to task here. Oopsie, let's go back here. Oh, yep. Let's go back here. Yep, we have ID, status, title. I think I missed that. So I missed title. So let's make sure that we add title over here. Actually, it should be here. So title equals, title is also of type string. Okay, good. So this interface is going to define each of the tasks inside the task list. Now, because this is an array of that interface, I'm going to pass in that type to the use state statement, and I'm going to tell it that, okay, this is not just a task, it's an array of that task. And I believe we can import that from components interfaces automatically, and I love VS Code, really. It's awesome. Okay, so this hasn't really changed anything when it comes to rendering, but right now we know what kind of type this task list is. So it's an array of tasks, and inside each of these tasks have ID, status, title, category, details, and we know the type of each of them. And you can see here, I think if we go here randomly and say something like task list, the first item, and then dot, and then I can already have access to these things. And this is actually coming from me defining the property. And you can see here property task.category, and it has to be a string. Property task.details, it has to be a string. Property task.id, it has to be a string, and so on. Good. So with that out of the way, now that we actually have correct types for our tasks, we can go ahead and write a function that will take the ID of that task and mark it as done. So let's call it that. So mark as done equals, and it's going to take an ID, and that ID is going to be a string, and it's going to do the following. The first thing I'm going to do is actually take out that required task, or the dragged task in this case, dragged task from the task list. So I am going to run a filter function. And that filter function will have access to each task and its index, and it's going to return a task that which ID, if it's going to return only the tasks that have an ID that matches the parameter being passed into the function. Beautiful. And just to show you what's going on here, what I will do is I'm actually going to console log dragged task, console log dragged task. This is really cool. And this is really cool over there. Everything is good. All right. So what I want to do now is actually execute that function on drop. And to be able to do that, I need to get access to that function from this component, which in this case is the box target. Now, the easiest and the simplest way to do this is to simply just create a context and pass that function into that context. So let's do that. So let's do something called card context equals create context, yep, create context from React. And the initial value of this is going to be mark as done, and that mark as done is going to, we can initialize it as null, I think, or we can actually be accurate and say it's a function that is going to take a string, beautiful, and is going to execute some stuff, basically. It's going to take a string and it's going to execute some stuff. Okay, good. Now, what we want to do is actually pass in that value with a context provider. So let's wrap all of this in card, oopsie, no, it's not like that, card context, yep, okay, good, card context, and I can't do this, and the reason for that is that Emmet will expect it to be a class name. So I'm just going to do this card.context, and what I want to do is now add .provider here, but I don't want to write it here and then go down and write it over there. So to fix this, I'm going to select this and then Command D from my keyboard. Now I'm actually, let me just make this smaller for a second. Now I'm actually selecting both of these texts at the same time, and I can write after both of them. So let me do this, provider. So I'm just adding provider to both of them at the same time. Good. So it's always good to know your tricks and tips with VS Code because it's extremely, extremely powerful and it's awesome. Alrighty, so now it's complaining because it says, okay, this is a provider, but there's no value, and I'm passing any value into it. So let's do that. Let's pass a value of an object that will have mark as done. A value of an object that will have mark as done. And everything is squeaky. It's awesome. Okay, now the only issue here is that I'm not exporting this because I need to be able to export this when I go to be able to use it from box target. Let's go into box target, and what I need to do here is actually bring in that context and use it. So let's do this, const destructure this stuff and say I'm expecting mark as done to come out from use context, which is coming from React. And this is going to use card context, which is also going to be auto-imported. I absolutely love VS Code. It's so good. It's just complaining here because React stuff has to be at the top. Simple stuff. Good. So I now have access to actually mark as done. And I also have access to item here. And now all the pieces of the puzzle are getting together. So what I can do here is say mark as done item, mark as done item.id. Mark as done and pass in item mark as done item and pass in item.id over there. Okay, now the issue here is saying, okay, you know what? You're saying that you want to execute that item has an ID on it, but it doesn't really exist on the type drag object with type. Now, this is a TypeScript thingy, and it's basically saying, okay, there is a drag object with type. This is coming from React DnD, and that drag object with type doesn't really have an ID to it, so something is wrong. Something is wrong with your types. So your types are messed up, bro. Go and fix them. Basically, that is what TypeScript is saying. Now, there's a couple of things that you could do here. What I would like to do here is actually maybe execute a new, maybe assign a new value here. So what I will do here is maybe say as, or actually I would actually have to make an interface for it. So let's do that quickly here, and then later we can move it. So let's do an interface of item, and that interface will have, it will have a type. Yep, it will have a type. In this case, is going to be a string. We can put it as any just to stay safe. And it will also have an ID, which is also a string. So let's try to specify that item here is going to be of type item. Okay, now it's not complaining anymore because it now understands that interface item. Oh yeah, well, it actually starts with an I, so I don't know what to tell you. So yeah, it's basically saying item now is one of these items which actually have an ID on it. So what happens here is the first thing I need to do actually before I show you this is actually take this and put it in interfaces. Put it here and export interface called item, and this item just command dot and import it. Beautiful, beautiful workflow. Good stuff. All right, cool. Now, what will happen is whenever I drop this here, I am actually seeing that object. I'm actually seeing that object. Now, it's actually an array in this case, and that is because the filter operation returns an array, so I can select the first object of that array by doing this. Alrighty, so if I drop this here again, let's go for it. This is the actual object. Object ID equal 20, status, work in progress, title, and so on. At the same time here, 88, work in progress, shopping, and so on. So this is great. Let's just pause for a second and see what is actually happening. So right now, I have done a couple of things. One, I made sure that whenever I drag this item, I'm getting access to things in that item, which is, in this case, is going to be the ID. And I did that by passing into the item here. I'm passing in an ID, and this ID is coming from the prop. So I made sure that whenever I pass this into here, I am also passing one of the props of this specific task into the drop zone. And then later, I took that prop, which is ID in this case, and I used it to execute a function with that ID. The only thing missing right now is actually just to change that from work in progress into done, which will make it show up here. Let's do that. We are almost done. That is great. Cool. So now I have access to my drag task, right? So what I want to do is I actually want to simply change that drag task status to done. So you can do that very simply. So we can do drag task dot status is we're gonna shift this to done. Very simple. And so now I have my new drag task being mutated into the drag task in which has a status of done. What I want to do now is actually formulate a new state that will have all the other tasks, right, except this task, and will also have the new dragged task. So you might think that this is really complicated, but it's actually not that bad. So what we'll do here is set task list. And here, what I will do is I'm going to select all the other tasks that don't match that ID. So you know what I mean? Like we have one task that's being selected, which we already altered. We call it drag task. And now I want to include everything else. So this is going to use, again, a filter. Oopsie. Oh, sorry. This is going to use a filter. And that filter will take task and I, and will take that task and return anything that task.id does not equal ID. So now we are actually returning all the task list without that ID. Okay, so what I'm expecting here is that right now what I'm doing is I'm actually formulating a new piece of state, and that new piece of state will have all the other elements except the element that I have dropped. So if I take that task and drop it here, it should simply just disappear. Good, right? So that means that our logic here is working. But that's not actually what I want. What I want is to leave those ones that I haven't really touched and add to them the new mutated task that I have here called drag task, in which I have switched the status to done. So let's do that with a concat, and I am going to simply add dragged task here. So I'm going to add drag task here, and I save this. Right now, I'm expecting that whenever I drop this here, it should basically just appear here, which is awesome. So this is working now. So this is our first drag and drop interaction. So whenever we drag this here, it's actually dropping over there, and you can't really drop it back, which this is what we're going to be working on soon. But right now, we have the first drag and drop interaction working, in which case you can just drop the stuff here. I want to go back to box target just to make it a little bit more beautiful than this. So if there's something over, make it red 200. If there's nothing over, man, please give me a break and make it transparent, not transport. Transparent. Just make it transparent, because that is way much better. So let's try that again. If I drag this over here, I know that there is a drop target here. I leave it and it just drops over there. And I drag this here and I leave it, it drops over there. And the same thing happens here. And this is really beautiful. I'm very excited for this. So this is our first drag and drop interaction there. Now, this approach is okay in general terms. What you want to do now is actually make sure that we can actually drag this back here to work in progress. And your first instinct right now might be, okay, you know what? I know what to do. We can actually write down another function that will be called constmark as work in progress, and and then use the same idea, and then also have another box target over here, and we can drag it back. While this will actually work, in the next section, I will teach you how we can change the way we think about the problem, because if we get it working that way, we are only limited to, okay, done task and work in progress task, done task and work in progress task. But what I want to be able to do is structure the code in a way that is actually scalable. So my objective next is not going to be, okay, I can drag it, drop it back, but my objective next is going to be, I want to have 5 lists: work in progress tasks, done tasks, test tasks, tasks assigned to Joe, whatever, right? And I want to make it in a simple way in which I can drag this and drop it anywhere and it will show up there. This is exactly what we will be doing in the next section. I will see you guys there.